When we think of the dangers of prehistory, the first thing that usually comes to mind is a scene of a wild chase through the jungle, an enormous beast with teeth as sharp as blades bursting through the bushes, while a primitive human runs breathlessly, trying to escape in a panic. Fire flickers inside a cave, the icy wind roars through the mountains, and fear clings to your skin like a shadow. It's the classic image, raw, primitive, and full of fangs. But what few imagine is that the greatest threat didn't come from those predators. It wasn't the cave lion, nor the saber-toothed tiger. For a good part of our evolution, Earth was not an exclusive stage for Homo sapiens. We shared the world with our cousins, the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, Homo floresiensis, and several others we are only just beginning to discover. But there was one in particular that stands out from the rest. Not only for the tools and bones left behind, but for the uncomfortable questions it continues to raise, questions about violence, about the thirst for power. They were called Homo Heidelbergensis, possibly the last common ancestor between us, the Neanderthals, and perhaps even the Denisovans. They were not exclusive to one place. These humans roamed across Europe, Africa, and Western Asia between 700,000 and 200,000 years ago. During one of the most extreme eras of Earth's climate, imagine glaciations that erased all traces of life in Europe, or brutal droughts that dried up African rivers in just a few generations. Water, food, shelter, everything became a luxury. And in the midst of that adversity, Homo heidelbergensis did not give up. They evolved. They became creatures out of a nightmare: broad shoulders, thick bones, a stature similar to ours, and brains nearly the same size as our own. They had tools, knew how to live in groups, and possessed a surprising intelligence. They didn't reach the top by luck. They reached it through blood, strategy, and sheer determination. The world of Homo heidelbergensis was no place for the weak. It was like a colossal arena where life was at stake in every corner. They coexisted with creatures capable of killing a human with a single claw, a bite, or even a simple blow. In Africa, they shared territory with giant prehistoric hyenas, saber-toothed cats like the Homotherium, and crocodiles so enormous that today they survive only in fossils and nightmares. In Europe, the threats came in the form of cave lions, larger than any modern lion, and short-faced bears over 3 meters tall, enough to take down 3 people with a single swipe. In colder regions, the danger came from packs of wolves, giant boars, and even mammoths. In that world, an injury or getting trapped wasn't just bad luck, it was a death sentence. But among all those shadows and fangs, there was an even more fearsome threat: man himself. It is very possible that Homo heidelbergensis was the first species to hunt its own kind. This isn't a metaphor, it's not a legend. There is real evidence: skulls with fractures, burned human bones, cut marks made with stone tools in places on the body that have nothing to do with funeral rituals. They don't speak of respect for the dead, they whisper of something darker. At first, scientists thought these might have been desperate acts, that famine or extreme crises pushed these people to do the unthinkable. But then the evidence became more insistent, time and again, in Europe and Africa. And a disturbing question arose: what if Homo heidelbergensis was not only a victim, but also an intentional predator that hunted its own species? There is no longer any doubt. This is not a post-apocalyptic story. It is the origin. We are talking about beings who could start a fire with one hand and wield an axe with the other. People capable of showing compassion at dawn and attacking without hesitation at dusk. If this is true, then the roots of war, of organized conflict, were not born with ancient empires, but with the darkness that dwelled within our ancestors. The first seeds of blood and power sprouted in prehistory, deep within the earth and even deeper within human nature. And no place reveals this with greater clarity than Cima de los Huesos, the Pit of Bones, a name that already carries the full weight of a legend, hidden among the mountains of Atapuerca in northern Spain. This is no ordinary archaeological site. It is a silent cemetery where more than 7,000 human bone fragments belonging to at least 28 individuals have been found. All were Homo Heidelbergensis. But why did they end their days at the bottom of that dark pit? Why were their bones thrown there with no signs of burial or rituals? The skull known as cranium 17 has two lethal fractures, not caused by an accident, but by intentional violence. It wasn't a single blow, there were two, as if the attacker needed to make sure the victim would never get up again. And then, a strange object appears alongside the human remains, a hand axe made of quartz, crafted with such precision that it seems more like an offering than a tool. Researchers named it Excalibur, not for the legend, but for the mystery. But if you think the darkness only lurked in icy Europe, you are mistaken. Thousands of kilometers away, in the middle of the arid and cracked lands of the Awash Valley in Ethiopia, the very cradle of humanity, another mystery whispers truths that no one wants to accept as real. In 1976, a group of archaeologists discovered an ancient skull they named the Bodocranium. This fossil, over 600,000 years old, likely belongs to a Homo Heidelbergensis, and it is not just a relic, it is an open-ended story. On the surface of the bone, multiple precise cuts were found, clearly made with stone tools. But the strange thing is not that they exist, but where they are. The incisions are concentrated around the main points of muscle attachment, indicating they were not caused by accident or by animals. It was a systematic, deliberate, and very precise action. Someone carefully removed the flesh from the face and skull right after the person's death. Why? That is the question that, after more than 4 decades, no one has been able to answer with certainty. Some researchers think it could be an ancient funeral rite, a symbolic way of freeing the deceased from their earthly form. But there are others, with a colder perspective, who dare to propose a more chilling hypothesis: cannibalism. And what makes this idea even more unsettling is the almost total absence of animal remains at the discovery site. There are no signs that it was a commonplace for processing food. So, if the only bones found there are human, the question becomes inevitable: did we eat each other? Not for ritual, but for necessity. If that's true, then the darkness of our past was not limited to the cold caves of the north. It extends to the very origin of our species, to the place where the first human steps were taken. But the traces of cannibalism are not limited to Atapuerca or Bodo. As the layers of time are unearthed, a broader pattern begins to emerge, one that suggests this behavior may have been much more common than we once imagined. In northern Kenya, archaeologists discovered a 1.45 million-year-old tibia with very clear-cut marks, as if someone had removed the flesh from that bone. This could be one of the oldest cases of cannibalism ever recorded. We still don't know for sure which species did it, but the evidence suggests that interactions between early hominins were much more complex than we were told. And then, a chilling question arises: if they didn't do it for hunger, then why researchers calculated the caloric value of human flesh and found that it does not provide as much energy as other large animals like mammoths or bison. This weakens the survival theory. Perhaps these acts were not only for nourishment, but also a primitive form of punishment, revenge, or even ritual. From the repetitive wounds on certain skeletons to the intentional cuts on skulls, everything indicates that Homo Heidelbergensis had a deep understanding of death not just as an end, but as a symbol, a message, a form of power. And amidst that brutality, they also left clear traces of their intelligence. In Schöningen, Germany, 300,000-year-old wooden spears were found with a surprisingly precise design, with a perfectly balanced center of gravity and an ideal length for being thrown from a distance. This shows that Homo heidelbergensis was not just a survivor. They were true engineers, hunters with intention and technique. In Ethiopia, spears with stone tips, dating back almost 280,000 years, appeared, long before Homo sapiens came onto the scene. The combination of different materials to make tools required not only fine motor skills but also abstract thought and the ability to teach that knowledge to new generations. Even animal bones were utilized. In Olduvai Gorge, Tanzania, bone tools from 1.5 million years ago were found, revealing a conscious selection of materials, their transformation, and systematic use. We are no longer talking about instinct. This is culture. This is primitive technology. And so, a truth becomes undeniable, whether for hunting, defending themselves, or attacking each other. These tools reflect one thing: the evolution of the human intellect in a world bathed in blood, bones, and relentless competition. But among all the evidence of violence, cannibalism, and tools designed to kill, another story also begins to reveal itself, silently and subtly. A deeper, more delicate story, the story of care, of connection, and of the first spark of what would later define who we are society. Studying Homo heidelbergensis is not just looking at a distant past covered in stone and ash. It is also hearing the first echoes of how we began to treat one another, from cooperation to conflict, from compassion to the survival instinct. Their social life was complex, adaptive, and in many moments, surprisingly familiar. They lived in small groups, perhaps of 15 to 30 people, but they were not scattered, faceless communities. They were units connected by ties of blood, by shared work, by common responsibilities and emotions. Living in small groups gave them a vital advantage in the unpredictable Pleistocene climate. When animals migrated or water became scarce, they could move quickly, with agility, as if they were a single body. Some sites, like Boxgrove in England or Schöningen in Germany, show signs of repeated visits. These were not coincidences. These places may have been ancient meeting points where various groups gathered to trade tools, form couples, share food, and perhaps tell stories. Could this have been the earliest form of a town square, a primitive seed of a larger community, of collective memory, of tradition? And even within that savage struggle for survival, they also knew how to care for each other. In Cima de los Huesos, that enigmatic prehistoric cemetery, archaeologists found the remains of an individual with a severe pelvic deformity, to the point that he could not walk on his own. And yet he survived for years. That was not a coincidence. Someone fed him, protected him, carried him without receiving anything in return. Why? Out of compassion, out of a bond that goes beyond instinct. Because in that moment, Homo heidelbergensis ceased to be just a species and began to be human, not for knowing how to make fire, not for knowing how to make spears, but for loving someone who could offer nothing more than their mere presence. That was the most primitive act of empathy. And empathy is what gave rise to all myths, all religions, all societies, all human dreams. So, what is it that truly makes us human? It's not the bones, not the tools, not the weapons. It is the decision not to abandon one another, even in a world where life and death are separated by a single fall. And perhaps, from those dark caves, from those first flames next to fractured skulls, a message continues to burn to this day: we are stronger when we are not alone. But where there is unity, there is also always the risk of rupture. The bond between the first humans was not just a protective shield. Sometimes it was also the spark that ignited conflict. And here we enter a little mentioned but fundamental part: violence, territory, and social rules. Homo Heidelbergensis were not solitary hunters, they were social beings. They shared tasks, protected each other, and probably distributed food according to the group's needs. But that bond, however strong, was not free from tensions. These small communities, as united as they were not paradises. Where there is cooperation, there is also friction. And when the first humans began to live closely together, they unwittingly opened a new chapter, that of social conflict. The proof is there. In Cima de los Huesos, for example, the skull known as cranium 17 shows two almost identical fractures. They were not caused by an accident. It was not the work of a predator. It was human violence and execution, revenge, or simply pure rage. No one knows for sure, but it leaves us with a disturbing question: did rules, punishments, some primitive form of justice exist in those first communities? The evidence is still fragmentary, but the patterns of repeated trauma in several skeletons suggest that conflicts were not exceptions. On the contrary, they might have been part of the social fabric. Perhaps they were the first to have unwritten rules, and also the first to break them. Moreover, as the population grew and resources became scarcer, the boundaries between groups began to overlap. Rivers, animal migration routes, lands for shelter. Everything became something worth defending. At various sites in Europe and Africa, signs of repeated occupations in areas with abundant resources have been found. This suggests that some groups may have claimed certain territories and were even willing to fight for them. Conflict between groups is no longer a simple theory. The wounds from blunt force trauma on skulls found at Cima, Bodo, and Kabwe show that this violence was not isolated or limited by sex or age. It could have been the result of raids, disputes over land, or revenge between clans. And as if all that were not complex enough, there is something else that brings Homo Heidelbergensis even closer to what we are today: language. Although we have no direct evidence of their speech, studies of the thumb bones from Castel di Guido, Italy, along with the base of the skull, suggest they were capable of emitting complex sounds. If we add to that a brain size between 1,200 and 1,300 cm, their skill with tools, and their group hunting, everything points to an astonishing ability. They knew how to communicate. And if they could share ideas, give signals when hunting, teach their children how to make a spear, that was already culture, and that culture could have extended to how they treated their dead. In Cima de los Huesos, the bodies seem to have been intentionally placed in a deep chamber, accessible only through a dangerous passage. Perhaps it was just a practical way of disposing of the corpses, but it could also have been one of the first funeral rituals, a sign of consciousness about loss, death, and something that goes beyond instinct. So, in every cut, in every fracture, in every sharpened stone, we not only hear the echo of violence, we also hear the first voice of a civilization without a name, but one that we once were. And so, as we continue to decipher bones, tools, and behaviors, a truth impossible to ignore emerges. Homo Heidelbergensis was not just a chapter in human history, it was the gateway between instinct and consciousness, between the beast and the human being. They were the species on the verge of transformation, with the Schoningen spears as a witness, weapons designed not only to hunt animals, but also potentially to be turned against another human being. Homo Heidelbergensis showed that they were not only expert hunters, but that in their darkest moments, they were also hunters of their own kind. But what made them unique was not instinct, but contradiction. They knew how to collaborate and also how to betray. They knew how to care and also how to kill. They knew how to build a community and also how to destroy it from within. In them lived the first fragments of trust, empathy, resentment, revenge, and perhaps love a society far from perfect, but with enough depth to be called human. Homo Heidelbergensis occupies a crucial place in evolutionary history. They were the bridge between Homo erectus and the human species that came after the Neanderthals, the Denisovans, and us, Homo sapiens. They appeared around 700,000 years ago, carrying within them both the traits of the past and the signs of the future. A large skull, robust bodies, complex tools, everything pointed to an amazing capacity for adaptation. From the African savannas to the cold forests of Europe, this global dispersal facilitated an evolutionary diversification. In Europe, they became the Neanderthals. In Asia, the Denisovans. In Africa, they were our direct ancestors. And although the name Heidelbergensis no longer appears on any identity document, their traces live within us. Between 1% and 3% of the DNA of non-African people comes from Neanderthals. Some populations in Oceania carry up to 4% Denisovan genes. These ancient genes help us resist the cold, strengthen our immune system, and even affect our skin color and the way we process oxygen. This means we are not only descended from Homo sapiens, we are heirs to a complex family, a genetic and cultural network woven over hundreds of thousands of years. The archaeological records confirm that they did not live by simple instinct. They knew how to plan their hunts, use fire, and build shelters. The perfectly balanced Schoningen spears reveal long-term strategic thinking. These actions laid the foundations for the culture of all subsequent human species. And then they disappeared, not because of a sudden catastrophe, but because of a series of slow but relentless changes, an increasingly extreme climate, a growing scarcity of resources, and finally, the encounter with their own descendants. Homo sapiens rose from Africa. The Neanderthals resisted in Europe. The Denisovans occupied the plateaus of Asia, and the Heidelbergensis were forced to retreat. They were not vanquished because they were weak, but because their children evolved faster, smarter, more connected. But no one can erase their name from history, because within each of us, there is a part small, yes, but essential that belongs to them. And perhaps in our current behaviors, emotions, and conflicts, the echo of those who crossed the threshold between instinct and humanity still resonates. So the next time you wonder what truly makes human beings special, remember that the answer is not only in the future, it is also in the most ancient shadows. Where a nameless species did the unthinkable, it chose to love and to hurt at the same time. And maybe, just maybe, in the end, the hunter became the prey. If you have come with us this far, thank you. Not only for your time, but for daring to look directly into the darkest corners of human history, those places where our ancestors left not only tools and bones, but also unanswered questions about who we really are. Homo heidelbergensis was not just a bridge between species. They may have been the first to show us, in the harshest way, that sometimes survival means accepting that the worst enemy has your own face, a predator created in your own image.